Remember those two astronauts that got stuck in space back in June? Well, it appears Boeing has had enough of that because apparently they're getting out of the space business. For decades, Boeing's been NASA's go-to. It helped develop the International Space Station, and they were even a huge part in putting a man on the moon. Buzz was supposed to say,
"It's one small step for man,
and one giant leap for Boeing."
These are some of the biggest milestones in space exploration history, and Boeing was at the center of them. But right now, Boeing is in a world of hurt down here on Earth. It's been a rough couple of years and the pressure is building. And to relieve some of that pressure, they're looking to shed some weight. So let's look at what a sale of their space business means for Boeing, the industry at large, and what almost all of the headlines are glossing over. In an earnings call last week, the new CEO, Kelly Orberg, said this.
I think that we're better off being doing less and doing it better than doing more and not doing it well.
That's a weird way of saying we're doing too much. And one area of the many they're struggling with is the space division, which falls under Boeing's larger Defense, Space, and Security Unit, the part that mainly cranks out fighter jets and helicopters for the Pentagon. That division as a whole reported a $3.1 billion loss against $18.5 billion in revenue in the first 9 months of 2024. And the space division is responsible for a decent chunk of that $3.1 billion. If you've even remotely glanced at the headlines this past year, you've probably seen that the Starliner has been one of Boeing's biggest headaches. And if you don't remember, well, let me fill you in a bit. Back in 2014, NASA tapped Boeing to build a spacecraft to shuttle astronauts to and from the International Space Station. They handed Boeing $4.2 billion to develop the Starliner, while SpaceX, they were the new kid on the block at the time. They got $2.6 billion to make the Crew Dragon, as essentially a second option. Keep those numbers in mind though, they're key here. The Starliner program since has been anything but smooth. Originally, Boeing planned to run test flights by 2015. However, those didn't happen until 2019. And it wasn't until 2022 that they finally docked with the ISS during an unmanned test flight. Fast forward to June of 2024, and Boeing launched Starliner's first crewed flight test. That mission, though, went way past the 7 days that were originally planned. So much so that the astronauts are still up there, and it's been about 5 months already. You see, once Starliner docked on the ISS, Boeing found a few issues, and NASA decided it just wasn't worth the risk to bring the crew back on it. So, who would bring them home? Well, SpaceX, of course. I mean, at this point, the Crew Dragon is basically running like a New York City cab service compared to Starliner. On their small little $2.6 billion budget, the Dragon has completed 17 crewed trips and safely transported over 30 astronauts to and from space, a stark contrast from Boeing. This whole debacle hasn't been great for Boeing PR-wise, but the Starliner program is even worse when you look behind the curtain at the numbers. In a filing with the SEC, Boeing reported a $250 million loss in Q3 for the Starliner program. That's following a $125 million loss in Q2. And to take a step back on the project as a whole, remember that $4.2 billion they originally got to build the Starliner? So far, they've spent $6 billion. Meaning their total loss on the project is over $1.8 billion. Now, Boeing CEO had two quotes on their earnings call last week I want to revisit. First is this one. He said, "Clearly our core commercial airlines and defense systems are going to stay with the Boeing company for a long run. But there's probably some things on the fringe that we can be more efficient with or that distract us from our main goal here. $1.8 billion over budget on a space taxi might be the fringe he's talking about here." The next one is where things get interesting though. There are some areas where we may be at one contract phase, and do we want to go to the next contract phase? That we will sit and evaluate. That right there is what the space sale headlines are glossing over. You see, government contracts generally come in one of two ways: fixed cost or cost plus. Cost plus means companies get reimbursed for all the expenses at the end of the project, plus a little extra so they can make a little bit of profit. Fixed cost though is a different story. It's one set price for the whole project. Go over budget, the company has to eat it. So when Boeing hints it's interested in selling off its space division, what it's really wanting to sell is the fixed price Starliner contract that's bleeding them dry. Funny enough though, there's no mention of the SLS rocket contract, the one Boeing's building to take us back to the moon with the Artemis mission. That one's a cost plus, so when it kicked off in 2014, the budget was $2.8 billion. By 2021, it had ballooned to $8.9 billion. So, while Boeing might be bleeding itself dry with projects like Starliner, it's also racking up a pretty hefty tab from NASA on other projects. But maybe space development just isn't Boeing's game anymore. 2 of their major projects have been delayed almost a decade and are insanely over budget. Not to mention, recently a satellite Boeing built for Intelsat mysteriously blew up in orbit. Now the Space Force is tracking around 20 pieces of debris, threatening our GPS satellites and adding a whole new layer of risk to hundreds of billions of dollars worth of satellites floating around up there. So if Boeing does want to get out of the space game or just dump their Starliner contract, who would buy it? We know it wouldn't be SpaceX, they obviously have superior tech inside their space taxi. Next in line would be Bezos and Blue Origin, which were actually exploring an option to take over some of Boeing's NASA programs earlier this year before Boeing's new CEO even came in. Blue Origin has been gearing up for its new Glenn rockets to compete with SpaceX, so now might be the time for Boeing to step aside and hand over control of the Starliner program to Blue Origin. Because really at this point in time, as Boeing's CEO called them, fringe projects are taking away from Boeing's main focus. And it doesn't seem like Boeing's main focus is space. They've been in a mess of issues with their planes too. Over the past year, whistleblowers have called out the company for putting profits over safety, with insiders exposing some serious shortcuts in quality control. Just last year, a door plug flew off mid-flight on a 737 MAX. And let's not forget the 737 MAX crashes a few years back. On top of quality control, they've had production issues since mid-September, when over 33,000 Boeing workers in Seattle and Portland went on strike, which crippled production. The machinists are demanding a 40% wage bump, the return of their lost pension plan, and a promise to keep future aircraft production in unionized shops in the Pacific Northwest, rather than going to non-union facilities like Boeing's plant in South Carolina. But so far, the union has rejected all of the deals presented to them. For Boeing, reaching a deal is their most important task at hand because it's bleeding them dry. They're losing as much as $1 billion a week, which comes right after the CFO said Boeing will continue to burn cash through 2025. So to keep the lights on, Boeing this week sold $21 billion in stock, trying to fight off also a credit downgrade to junk status, which would crank up the borrowing cost even more. So Boeing's clearly in a tight spot, and dropping its dead weight like the Starliner contract may help alleviate some of its pain points. If not, we might have a front row seat to the collapse of one of America's most iconic brands.